In fact, it was not until 1912, just before World War I, that reliable steam-driven excavators were introduced. Imported from USA and Britain, they were seen to be essential for the deep cuttings because of the awful wetness of the country and the need to cut through rock. Also, labour had now become very expensive. These machines, fired with wood or coal, could now shift rock from underwater. Steam locomotives on rails cleared the material. However, there was still a need for much handwork, the hard yakka of the labourer. And although some workers went back to Adelaide in disgust after only half a day's work, there were free cabins, tents and beds, and also half the 250 workers being married and their wives coming with them were more content to stay. The early 1920s, the period just after the First World War, seemed to be a period of consolidation, and most work was in the deepening and widening of drains because the first schemes had not been as successful as hoped. Yet on top of the deepening work, a total of 200 kilometres of new drains were excavated at a cost of nearly $1 million. And the most significant event at this time was the first stage of Main Drain M, which ran 30 kilometres across the ranges and flats and had its outlet at Beachport. While the Drain KL ran parallel to Drain M for 60 kilometres and has its outlet at Robe. The Great Depression of the 1920s and early 30s meant there was little money for more work, yet study and planning continued. Mr. W.M. Anderson was appointed resident engineer in 1925 at Beachport, and the present organisation, the South Eastern Drainage Board, was set up as a statutory authority in 1931. Anderson's accumulated knowledge from the 1920s until World War II period in the early 1940s enabled a so-called final grand scheme to be set in motion, which also later ran in parallel with the need to settle returning soldiers on the land. This created a lift in optimism for the future of the farm economy and export of food to Britain, which is itself another big story. Most of the work of this 1950s period was conducted under contract. Many contractors underestimated the wetness and lost money. And labour was very hard to get. Many European migrants, particularly skilled Italian workers, some of whom had earlier been prisoners of war, did a sterling job at filling that need. Of course, the pressure for more drainage had always come from the locals who lived with the problems, and not always from the government. The classic example of private enterprise, vision and determination resulted in what is known as the Wokwine cutting. In 1957, landholder Murray McCourt could see the great potential for farming the 400 hectares of useless flooded peat called Wokwine Swamp, if it could be drained. The South East Drainage Board agreed to the idea of cutting through the Wokwine Range to a depth of 28 metres, yet no government would fund such an enterprise. So Murray McCourt, who had experience of construction engineering during the war, and his assistant Dick McIntyre, with a D7 crawler tractor, small by today's standards, set out with huge tenacity to remove the 250,000 cubic metres of soil and rock and the 8 kilometres of associated drains to take water from the Wokwine Swamp and discharge it into Lake George. It took a determined 3 years to complete, yet bureaucratic red tape meant that permission to run the water into Lake George was given only weeks before the cut was finished. Now the 400 hectares is a fertile farming area, even in the wet year of 2004. This huge cutting, startling to view, is now a must-see destination for tourists to Robe or Beachport. In other places, contractors for new drains were learning lessons of how to deal with the great wetness, and then, also, larger bulldozers and scrapers became available in the 1960s. They helped a lot, but it soon became clear that they also had their problems, and sometimes became hopelessly bogged. This dozer was bogged deep underwater with the engine still running, and they had to get a diver to get down to turn it off. Then there was a huge 6-yard capacity dragline excavator which Roche Brothers contractors used in 1961. This was 4 times bigger than anything used before, and with this machine they began to make their contract profitable at last. The project administration was shifted from Millicent to Penola in 1965, from where the final stage of the Bull Lagoon and Drain C construction was organised. Drain C was important to drain some of the land which previously was certainly not suitable for horticulture, yet now is stretched into growing wine. While Bull Lagoon is a grand flora and bird sanctuary and tourist venue. Although some drains are longer, Drain M and its beginning at Mosquito Creek and Bull Lagoon catches my imagination. Near Struan House, the Mosquito Creek crosses the main Naracoorte to Penola Road. This creek is one of the few natural waterways entering from Victoria, and although it only has a small catchment, it flows strongly after winter heavy rains, as shown in this 1949 flood scene. The water spreads over Bull Lagoon and out at this floodgate, which really marks the beginning of the historic Drain M, which then flows the remaining 80 kilometres to the sea at Beachport. This makes it a grand waterway and quite a river in its own right. The main reason for drainage had always been to increase the farm production of land in the southeast. This certainly has been achieved, and along with good land management, better livestock, trace elements and fertiliser and new high-value products, the Limestone Coast is now a glowing jewel of South Australia. Yet by the 1970s, many people were becoming concerned that water removal may have been overdone and may be detrimental to the water table and to flora and fauna in dry seasons. So the government of South Australia in 1976 decided that it would not approve more drainage until the impact of more drainage was properly studied. The South East Drainage Board was renamed the Conservation and Drainage Board and given this task of study. So by 1980, the board had an even better understanding of the very complex nature of the water resources. Recommendations on re-establishment of wetlands and weirs to block some of the flow were put into place. When a very wet year comes along, the old problems show up again, and the wonderful system of drains built by so much sweat and tears by so many people shows its full value. After careful study, more works to assist the flow northwards of saline water from the upper reaches of the Limestone Coast area to Salt Creek and the Coorong is planned or is taking place. Now, by using huge modern machines, which the men of the 1860s would have been pleased to have seen, huge volumes of soil or rock can be shifted, cutting through the barrier ranges to bring salted land back into production or to create wetland reserves for wildlife. Perhaps works and studies will continue for many years yet, and it will be hard to tell when finished should be called. The total length of government drains already approaches an impressive 1,500 kilometres, further than from Adelaide to Alice Springs. Yet it all leads towards the completion of the grand 1860s vision of men like George Goyder and later engineers like Anderson and others who came after them.